Hey everyone, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to put on our investigative journalist hats to uncover a totally fascinating ancient mystery, one that tells us so much about human nature, fear, and our need for protection. You know, whenever we look back at history, it's really just like investigating a cold case. We've got the artifacts, which are basically the evidence left behind at the scene, and it's our job to report on the facts and figure out what actually went down. So today, our investigation takes us deep into the sands of ancient Mesopotamia for a story involving a shattered empire, a sludge-filled well, and a wildly unique kind of home security system.
Picture this for a second. It's pitch black. You're dead asleep in your own bed, and suddenly you hear a bump in the night. What's the very first thing that makes you feel safe? Honestly, what is the best way to protect your home and the people you love from an intruder? And I mean, whether that intruder is a physical person or, something you can't quite see. We spend an absolute fortune today trying to answer that exact question.
Nowadays, we've got the whole shebang, right? We're talking digital alarms, glowing keypads, motion sensors on the driveway. But let's rewind a few thousand years to the ancient Mesopotamians. Their solution? These small, incredibly unassuming clay figurines of dogs. While we rely on Wi-Fi and electricity to sleep soundly, the people of the mighty Neo-Assyrian Empire relied on little lumps of clay. It sounds crazy to us, but it begs the question, how on earth could a piece of clay offer the exact same psychological comfort as a modern alarm system?
Well, to find out, let's get into Part 1, Unearthing the Nimrod Dogs.
Okay, picture the year 1951. Archaeologist Max Mallowan is out there excavating the ancient city of Nimrod. His team ends up literally hand-scooping this awful sludge out of a deep, incredibly dangerous well in the ruins of the Northwest Palace. Mallowan actually wrote down that the muck had the suffocating consistency of plaster of Paris. It was grueling work. But as it turns out, that sludge was an absolute archaeological miracle. It created the perfect oxygen-free conditions to preserve things that would have totally rotted away centuries ago. And out of all that suffocating muck, he pulls out exactly 5 perfectly preserved clay canine figurines. Now, if you wander through a museum today and see these little guys, you might think, oh, look at the cute ancient pets. But as any good investigator knows, looks can be super deceiving. The facts on the ground tell us a very different story. These absolutely were not toys, and they for sure weren't portraits of a beloved family hound. They were serious, highly intentional tools.
Which brings us to Part 2, the fall of an empire.
To figure out why these precious little artifacts were treated like garbage and chucked down a well, we have to look at the big picture. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was an absolute juggernaut. Starting around 912 BCE, it just expanded relentlessly in every single direction. It hit its absolute peak of power in the 7th century BCE under King Ashurbanipal. But you know how these things go, the empire simply grew way too large to manage. Ashurbanipal was basically the last king who had the personal clout and political skill to hold the whole massive puzzle together.
So when he finally died, it was open season. The empire started to fracture, and all those former vassal states, they saw their chance for revenge. You had the Babylonians, the Persians, the Medes, and the Scythians. They all banded together and just utterly sacked these great cities, including Nimrud. And I mean, the destruction was absolute. These invading armies were so furious that they vented their frustrations by taking precious items, gorgeous carved ivories, and yes, our little clay dogs, and throwing them straight down the local wells. And that is exactly how they ended up in that sludge for Max Mallowan to find thousands of years later.
All right, let's move on to Part 3, Magic and Mesopotamian Dogs.
See, to really get this, we have to understand the Mesopotamian mindset. For them, the supernatural wasn't just a spooky campfire story. It was their everyday reality. They saw themselves as literal co-workers with the gods. It was their actual job to maintain order and hold back the forces of chaos. But since the gods were busy, running the universe, everyday people had to protect themselves from ghosts, spirits, and demons using apotropaic magic. That's just a fancy academic term for evil-averting rituals and charms. They genuinely believed that what they did down here on Earth literally mattered up in the heavens. So, where do the dogs fit into all this? Well, in this ancient spiritual defense system, the dog was the supreme symbol. They directly associated dogs with Gula, the goddess of healing and the ultimate defender of homes. And the reason why is actually pretty brilliant. These folks were incredibly observant of nature. They noticed that when a dog got injured, it would instinctively lick its own wounds to heal. They literally saw the curative effect of a dog's saliva. So the dog became this powerful divine symbol of healing and protection.
But don't let the healing part fool you, because these were not just good boys. The actual names inscribed on these clay figurines are intensely aggressive. We're talking names like biter of his enemy and consumer of his life. I mean, wow, that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that these were fierce supernatural protectors. You definitely don't name a cuddly lapdog consumer of his life, right? These figures were designed to intimidate and literally destroy spiritual threats.
Let's crack the code on how this actually worked in Part 4, the Ritual of Protection.
So how does a simple lump of mud become a magical, enemy-biting guard dog? It required a highly structured, step-by-step ritual. First, a citizen would carefully craft the clay dog, which was basically their way of mimicking divine creation. You know, human beings shaping clay just like the gods supposedly shaped humans. Then came the absolute most critical step. They had to recite a very specific incantation, the Fierce Dog Spell, to wake up the spirit inside the clay. Once it was spiritually activated, they'd bury the dog beneath the floor, usually right under the doorstep, where it stood as an invisible, eternal sentinel against demons.
But here is where our investigation takes a really fun twist. Remember how I said Maliwan found 5 dogs in that well in Nimrud? Well, actually, scratch that. He found a 6th figurine down there too. But this one was a bit different. It had no name inscribed on it. And for literally decades, top-tier British scholars confidently categorized this mysterious 6th figurine as a cat.
But as journalists looking at the facts, this cat anomaly just doesn't check out. If you look at the historical records and omens, Mesopotamians completely viewed cats as untamable wild animals that just wandered around wherever they pleased. You would never, ever trust an unpredictable, feral animal with your family's magical home security. Even the king couldn't rely on a cat to catch mice in his palace, let alone fight off a demon. So, in 2013, researchers finally re-examined the whole group of artifacts and realized the truth. This cat was actually just a dog that happened to have a slightly feline-looking face. Case closed, the historical record was finally corrected.
So let's pull all our evidence together in Part 5, Ancient Home Security Systems.
Here's the thing. These Nimrud dogs, they weren't just working alone. They were just the first line of defense in a totally comprehensive, multi-layered security grid. Think of it like a defense-in-depth strategy. If a demon somehow slipped past the fierce dogs buried at the front door, boom, they'd have to deal with magical amuletic boxes placed perfectly in the 4 corners of the room. And if they got past those, there were even more protective charms positioned specifically around the 4 posts of the bed. It was a brilliant, holistic system, designed entirely to give these families peace of mind when they were at their most vulnerable, while they slept.
And that brings us to the real takeaway here. When you strip away the centuries, these ancient clay figures tap into a deeply human, absolutely timeless need to feel safe. We started this explainer by comparing our modern alarms to ancient clay. But when you get right down to the fundamental facts of human nature, are we really so different today? Whether you're obsessively checking the deadbolt, hanging a lucky horseshoe near the door, or punching a code into a glowing digital alarm system, you are engaging in a ritual of security. It really leaves us wondering, is the psychological comfort you get from a fierce little clay dog beneath your floorboards truly any different than the glowing keypad by your front door?